They thought firing me in front of 300 people would humiliate me into silence. What they didn't know was that I had prepared for this moment. Every ignored complaint, every buried memo, every stolen hour of unpaid work. One click, and their secrets weren't just mine anymore. They belonged to everyone. That's how a single farewell speech became the fuse for a corporate collapse no one could stop. If you've ever watched power crumble in real time, you'll understand why this story matters. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They wanted me to disappear quietly. After 15 years of building their projects, training their new hires, and covering for their mistakes, the CFO Charles Grant and HR Director Linda Parker called me into the auditorium and announced I was being let go. They dressed it up with phrases like restructuring and realignment, but everyone knew what it was. A public execution meant to remind the rest of the staff who held the power. The lights were hot on my face, the microphone already clipped to my collar, and Linda smiled that polished HR smile as she invited me to say a few words. They expected tears, maybe gratitude, maybe even shame. What they got was precision. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the big projector screen behind me went black for half a second before filling with red numbers that climbed like a thermometer about to explode. Overtime, hours unpaid, 42,317. Harassment complaints dismissed, 126. Safety violations buried, 89. For a moment the silence was total, as if the building itself had stopped breathing. Then the murmurs began. Employees whispering, shifting in their seats, phones lifting into the air to snap photos and record videos. Charles's voice cracked as he barked for the feed to be cut, but the IT staff didn't move. They weren't loyal to him. They were just shocked. The truth was finally on the wall, bold and undeniable. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. My voice stayed calm as I said, "This is what 15 years inside these walls has looked like. If you thought firing me would erase the truth, you miscalculated." That line didn't just hang in the room, it detonated. The farewell speech they staged to humiliate me had become the opening shot in the company's unraveling, and every person in that room knew they had just watched the first domino fall. Charles stumbled down the aisle toward the IT booth, red in the face, spitting orders that no one obeyed. Linda fumbled with her phone, probably texting security, but her hands were shaking. They had always relied on the same tactic: gaslight and intimidate until people doubted their own eyes. That tactic collapsed. The second my scheduled emails began to land. In every employee's inbox appeared files too specific to dismiss, scanned copies of injury reports marked resolved without treatment, harassment complaints signed by multiple witnesses but labeled unsubstantiated, budgets that showed safety equipment purchased but never delivered. Each attachment bore an executive signature. The staff didn't just look stunned, they looked furious, like a curtain had been torn away after years of being told it didn't exist. Some laughed bitterly, others swore under their breath, but most started forwarding the files straight from their phones. Screens lit up across the auditorium, not with the company's logo, but with the raw evidence of betrayal. For years, Charles had perfected the language of dismissal. Misunderstood data, taken out of context, not material to our success. He opened his mouth to try the same script again, but this time, no one was listening. The whispers had become a low roar, the kind of sound that rises when people realize they've been played for fools. I didn't move, didn't need to. The truth was working on its own, louder than any speech I could give. The gaslight machine they'd built to control us had sputtered, sparked, and gone dark, and the people who once feared them were now the ones holding the evidence. By the time I left the building that afternoon, the damage had already spread far beyond the auditorium. Reporters had caught wind of the screenshots flying across social media, and by noon, local news anchors were quoting directly from the documents with the kind of relish reserved for scandals too juicy to ignore. By 2 o'clock, a state senator demanded an investigation into what he called a pattern of corporate abuse hiding in plain sight. By evening, 3 different law firms had announced class action suits, each claiming they were already speaking with former employees who had stories to add. Charles stood in front of the cameras, insisting this was the work of a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. Linda, ever the professional face, called it miscommunication between departments. But the signatures in those files told a different story. They weren't anonymous allegations. They were records with dates, initials, and stamps of approval from the very executives now pretending ignorance. The press didn't have to dig. It was all served to them in neat, undeniable packages. What they never understood was that their real vulnerability wasn't me. It was the paper trail they thought they had buried. The chain reaction was simple. Once the first set of documents reached the public, more people added theirs. Whistleblowers who had been silenced for years now had proof they weren't alone. The company wasn't under attack from outside forces. It was bleeding out from the inside, and every new leak only cut them deeper. The next morning, I walked past the building just to see the faces behind the glass. What I saw was chaos disguised in business clothes. Executives who had strutted through the halls a day earlier now huddled in tense clusters, whispering in doorways. Charles barked into his phone so loudly that pedestrians on the sidewalk could hear him. Linda paced the lobby, pretending to reassure staff who no longer looked at her with respect, but with open contempt. The aura of control they had built over the years had evaporated overnight. Inside the cubicles, the silence that once came from fear had been replaced by the buzz of employees trading stories. People who had never spoken above a murmur were suddenly loud, furious, and unafraid. I overheard fragments as I lingered near the revolving doors. Someone from logistics telling how safety gear requests were denied for years, an assistant from HR explaining how sexual harassment complaints were funneled into a drawer, a designer recalling the exact moment her work was presented as Charles's personal innovation. These weren't new problems. They had always been there. But the difference was that now everyone believed them. And belief spreads faster than any virus. The board scrambled to issue statements about integrity and improving culture. But the words felt like smoke from a fire that had already burned the structure down. Clients started calling to cancel contracts, not wanting their names tied to scandal. Vendors pulled back credit. Payroll delays spread whispers of bankruptcy. I didn't have to touch a thing. The system they had carefully polished for investors was eating itself alive in front of its employees. For years, their survival had depended on silence. Now, every hallway conversation was another nail in the coffin, hammered down not by me, but by the voices they had refused to hear until it was too late. By the 4th day, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, it was unknown numbers I didn't recognize, then familiar ones I hadn't seen in years. The CEO's assistant left a voicemail dripping with desperation, offering me a chance to come back. Name your terms. Anything you want. Charles himself tried calling twice, his voice on the messages cracking between anger and pleading, insisting that I could still help clean this up if I played along. I didn't answer a single call. By the 5th day, the tone shifted. The begging turned into veiled threats, then blunt ones. Anonymous texts warned that I would regret this and that, when the company collapses, your name will be dragged down with it. They thought fear might undo me the way it had silenced so many others. But the truth was already loose, too loud to ever be stuffed back into a file drawer. Regulators had opened formal inquiries. The media had moved from speculation to daily coverage, lining up outside the glass tower with cameras waiting for the next executive to slip out the door. And inside the office, it was open rebellion. I watched from a cafe across the street as employees held hushed but furious meetings without managers, planning their own lawsuits, sharing copies of emails that made the earlier leaks look like warm-ups. Charles had spent years believing intimidation was power, but power had changed hands. They no longer feared him. They feared being caught with him. As the walls pressed in tighter, the calls and messages kept coming, a chorus of voices trying to claw back control of a story already beyond their reach. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Silence, for once, was mine to wield, and it was cutting them deeper than any words ever could. By the 10th day, the spectacle was impossible to ignore. Federal investigators walked straight into the lobby, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights as employees stepped aside, some smirking, others recording on their phones. Charles wasn't barking orders anymore. He was hiding in his office, blinds drawn, phone calls unanswered. 2 days later, the official announcement hit the press. Charles Grant had resigned, for personal reasons. The next morning, Linda Parker was escorted out by security, her designer tote clutched tight against her chest, as if it could shield her from the cameras waiting outside. The board tried to spin it as a leadership transition, but no one believed the lie. Investors bailed, clients froze contracts, and within a week, the stock price had dropped almost 50%. But the real damage wasn't the resignations or the headlines. It was the regulators' decision that came at the end of that same week. They didn't shut the company down. That would have been too clean, too merciful. Instead, they imposed continuous federal monitoring. Every contract, every payment, every payroll cycle now had to pass through oversight. It meant millions in fees every single month, an endless drain that no investor wanted to fund. They weren't being fined once. They were being strangled slowly, forced to bleed, until there was nothing left. I watched the news coverage with the same steady calm I had carried into that farewell speech. I didn't hack their servers. I didn't forge their documents. I hadn't even raised my voice. All I did was reveal the truth they had buried, and the truth did the rest. The company that once believed it could fire me without consequence was now trapped in a chokehold of its own making. And I knew, as the cameras showed Charles slipping into a black car with no destination, that nothing he did could reverse it. Their system had collapsed, not because I tore it down, but because it couldn't withstand the light. People kept asking me if I felt guilty, as though exposing the truth made me responsible for the collapse. I didn't. What I felt was clarity. For 15 years I had given them more than loyalty. I gave them my nights, my weekends, my ideas, my silence. In return, they discarded me like office furniture, expecting me to walk out quietly while they congratulated themselves on being ruthless. Charles believed firing me would erase my name from the building. Linda thought a staged farewell would humiliate me into silence. They both forgot one rule: reputations are fragile, but evidence is not. Watching their empire buckle under federal oversight didn't fill me with joy or gloating. It filled me with something sharper: precision. I hadn't orchestrated a show. I had simply allowed the facts to breathe, and the facts did what they were always going to do once light touched them. I didn't toast their downfall. I didn't post victory messages online. I sat in my apartment at night and watched the headlines scroll across the screen, calm as the collapse unfolded day by day. It wasn't the explosion they feared. It was the slow suffocation, the long unraveling of everything they thought was untouchable. My revenge wasn't fire or fury, it was patience. I had waited for years as they silenced voices, erased complaints, and pretended no one would ever hold them accountable. Now I understood. I didn't need to destroy them. I only needed to survive long enough to show the world what they really were. Months later, the company was nothing but a shell. The name that once carried weight in Chicago boardrooms had been erased from office directories and stripped from the glass tower that now stood half empty, its lights dark by early evening. Assets were sold off piece by piece, divisions spun away to competitors, executives scattered under the cloud of ongoing investigations. Former employees landed elsewhere, many of them stronger for having walked through the fire. A few reached out quietly to thank me, though I never asked for gratitude. I hadn't exposed them for applause. I did it so the collapse would become a warning, a reminder carved into corporate history that arrogance has a price. Charles had believed firing me would be the end of my story. Linda thought humiliation would keep me silent. What they didn't see was that their own corruption was the fuse, and all I did was light it in public. My revenge was never just about watching them fall. It was about making sure others in glass towers understood what could happen when they mistake silence for weakness. Walking past that empty building, I didn't see failure. I saw proof. Proof that truth, once freed, doesn't vanish. It multiplies. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't shouting over your enemies. It's building a silence so heavy that their downfall echoes in it long after they're gone. They thought I'd walk away broken. But what they didn't see was that silence is only power if people agree to keep it. The day they fired me was supposed to be my end, yet it became the day their carefully built empire began to collapse under its own weight. The lesson I carry from this is simple, but heavy. Truth has a way of surviving, even when people bury it under policy, intimidation, or money. For 15 years I stayed quiet, hoping loyalty would be enough. It wasn't. What changed everything wasn't rage or sabotage. It was patience, documentation, and timing. Corporate power thrives on the belief that no one will ever connect the dots. But when someone does, the entire structure can crumble in days. In life, whether it's a workplace, a friendship, or a relationship, the message is the same. When respect is denied and voices are silenced, consequences eventually surface. Revenge doesn't always need fire or destruction. Sometimes it's just revealing the truth and letting it breathe. The collapse of my company wasn't my victory. It was the natural consequence of their own arrogance. My satisfaction came not from gloating, but from knowing the system that had crushed so many others finally answered to its own failures. How to get started today. 1. Start documenting. Keep a quiet record of facts, dates, and patterns. 2. Build allies, even quietly. You don't win battles alone. 3. Choose timing over impulse. Patience multiplies impact. If this resonates, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more stories, and let's keep this conversation alive.